The night before the Challenger launched, a group of engineers begged NASA to stop. They had the data. They had the charts. They had photographs of damaged components from previous flights. They had a formal memo filed 6 months earlier, predicting exactly what would happen. They presented all of it in an official teleconference to the people with the authority to cancel the launch. NASA launched anyway. 73 seconds. That's how long it took. 73 seconds from liftoff to the moment 7 people died in front of a live television audience, including a classroom teacher whose students were watching from their school desks across America. The official story says the Challenger was a tragedy. It was not a tragedy. A tragedy is something that couldn't be stopped. This was something else. A disaster that was predicted in writing, documented through official channels, argued against in real time by the man who understood it best, and authorized anyway by the institution that had the power to say no. His name was Roger Boisjoly, and what happened to him after he told the truth is the part of this story that almost no one knows. In 1986, the Rogers Commission, the presidential panel convened to investigate the disaster, confirmed everything Boisjoly had warned about. Every memo, every data point, every objection he raised in that room the night before the launch. It's all in the official record, Volume 1, publicly available. The detail that breaks this story open entirely isn't the O-ring. It isn't the temperature. It's a single sentence spoken during a safety review, hours before launch, by a NASA manager. That sentence is in Act 4, and once you hear it, the word accident becomes impossible to use.
But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. On July 31st, 1985, Roger Boisjoly typed a memo. Not an email, a formal internal memorandum, submitted to Morton Thiokol management through official channels. The subject line read, SRM O-ring erosion / potential failure, Criticality 1. Criticality 1 is NASA's highest danger classification. It means one thing: loss of crew and vehicle. Boisjoly wasn't guessing. He had been studying the O-ring joint seals on the solid rocket boosters for months. He had reviewed the data from previous launches. He had seen the erosion patterns. And what he found was not ambiguous. The O-rings, the rubber seals designed to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping the booster joints, were degrading. Not in theory, in practice. On flights that had already happened. More specifically, they were degrading worse in cold weather. The memo was explicit. According to Boisjoly's July 31st, 1985 internal document, later entered into the record of the Presidential Commission.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident. He wrote that it was his opinion that the situation was a red flag, and that if the problem were not corrected, the result would be a catastrophe of the highest order: loss of human life. His own words, his own signature, 6 months before the launch. The memo was received by Morton Thiokol management. It was acknowledged. A task force was formed to investigate the O-ring problem. The task force was underfunded and behind schedule. Boisjoly later testified that resources were inadequate and that the urgency he intended to convey was not matched by the institutional response. This is the detail that should stop you. Not that the O-rings failed, not that it was cold that morning, but that the failure was predicted, in writing, with a formal classification of maximum danger, 6 months before the crew boarded the shuttle. And the institution that received that warning continued planning the launch. There's a second document, written 4 months after the first memo. It describes exactly what Boisjoly was told when he raised the alarm again. And the answer is the part no one reads. But history has a way of leaving behind traces, traces that don't fit the story we were told. To understand what Roger Boisjoly was up against, you have to understand what NASA was in 1986. Not what it became after the accident, what it was before. NASA in the mid-1980s was the most celebrated scientific institution in the United States. It had put men on the moon. It had built the space shuttle, a vehicle so complex, so audacious, that engineers called it the most sophisticated machine ever constructed by human hands. The shuttle program was America's proof that the country still led the world in science, in courage, in vision. The crew of mission STS-51L reflected exactly that vision. 7 people, a payload specialist, 2 mission specialists, a pilot, a commander, and a civilian. Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first teacher in space. Her students were watching. Her parents were in the stands at Kennedy Space Center. Millions of American school children had their classroom televisions turned on that morning. This was not just a launch. It was a national event. The Space Shuttle program had flown 24 successful missions before Challenger. 24. The engineers, the managers, the administrators, they had built a track record. The system worked. The risks were managed. There had been anomalies on previous flights, yes, including O-ring erosion. But the shuttle had always come back. The crew had always landed safely. In the logic of the institution, that history of success was the evidence of safety. This is the mindset Roger Boisjoly was trying to break through. He wasn't dealing with reckless people. He was dealing with people who believed, genuinely, that they had the situation under control. People who had built careers on the premise that NASA's processes were rigorous enough to catch and contain any problem. The shuttle didn't just represent American prestige, it represented their professional identity. And Lawrence Malloy. If you look at the surface, it makes sense, but the moment you scratch that surface, the whole thing starts to bleed. Lawrence Malloy was NASA's solid rocket booster project manager at Marshall Space Flight Center. He was the man on the other end of the phone during the teleconference on the night of January 27, 1986, the night before the launch. That teleconference lasted nearly 3 hours. It involved engineers and managers from Morton Thiokol in Utah and NASA officials at Marshall and Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The purpose was straightforward. Morton Thiokol's engineers had requested a launch delay. The temperature forecast for the following morning was dangerously low. Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson presented their data. Charts, erosion measurements from previous flights, the documented correlation between cold temperatures and O-ring damage. Their recommendation was unambiguous. Do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature on the launch pad the morning of January 28, 1986, was 29 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not a marginal difference. That is 24 degrees below the lowest temperature at which the O-rings had ever been tested or flown. Boisjoly was not asking NASA to apply a conservative safety margin. He was asking them not to operate a system in conditions it had never been designed or validated for. Malloy's response, according to testimony later given to the Rogers Commission, was this. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April? That sentence was spoken during a safety review about a crewed vehicle, hours before launch. What happened next is the part the official narrative has always struggled to explain cleanly. Morton Thiokol management asked NASA for a 5-minute caucus, a private recess. Boisjoly and Thompson were in the room. They argued again. They presented the same data again. And then Morton Thiokol's management did something that had never happened before in the shuttle program's history. They asked their engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. Those are the exact words. Documented. Testified to under oath before the Rogers Commission by Morton Thiokol Vice President Robert Lund, who was in the room when they were spoken. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a paper trail,
and it leads directly to the decision made in that room.
This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a paper trail, and it leads directly to the decision made in that room. After the caucus, Morton Thiokol management reversed the recommendation. They submitted a formal written approval to launch. 4 managers signed it. The engineers, Boisjoly and Thompson, did not. They were not asked to sign. According to Boisjoly's testimony before the Rogers Commission in 1986, he made one final attempt during the caucus to change the outcome. He stood up. He put his photographs of damaged O-rings on the table. Physical evidence from previous flights showing erosion at low temperatures. He looked at the managers directly. Nobody moved. The approval was signed. The teleconference ended. NASA had its authorization. What the Rogers Commission later established, in Volume 1 of its final report, published June 6, 1986, was not merely that the O-rings failed.
It was that the decision-making process that authorized the launch was fundamentally flawed. The Commission found that NASA and Morton Thiokol managers had accepted escalating risk over time without ever formally reassessing the safety threshold. They had flown with O-ring erosion on previous missions. The shuttle had returned safely, and each safe return had been unconsciously filed as evidence that the risk was acceptable. Sociologist Diane Vaughan, in her 1996 study, The Challenger Launch Decision, named this process. She called it the normalization of deviance, the gradual process by which a dangerous anomaly becomes routine because it hasn't caused a catastrophe yet. It isn't negligence, it isn't malice, it is something more insidious, an institution that mistakes survival for safety. The O-rings were always going to fail in those conditions. The data said so. The memo said so. Boisjoly said so. The institution heard all of it and launched anyway. And this is where it gets interesting.
The Rogers Commission didn't bury the institutional failure. They named it, documented it, and placed it at the center of their findings. Commissioner Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, conducted his own independent analysis. In a famous demonstration during the commission hearings, he dropped an O-ring sample into a glass of ice water and showed in real time that the material lost its resilience at low temperatures. Simple, undeniable. Performed in front of cameras. Feynman was so dissatisfied with the commission's final report that he threatened to remove his name from it unless his personal observations were included as an appendix. They were. Appendix F. In it, he wrote one of the most precise indictments of institutional failure ever committed to an official government document.
His conclusion, in his own words from Appendix F.
NASA's decision-making process suffered from a kind of magical thinking, an attitude that because previous flights had survived, future flights would too. He wrote that for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. The appendix was included. It was noted. It was praised. And then the shuttle flew again 17 months later, with the same institutional culture largely intact. On the morning of January 28, 1986, Roger Boisjoly did not go to the launch viewing area with his colleagues. He stayed inside. He had spent the previous night on the phone for 3 hours trying to stop this. He had put the photographs on the table. He had lost. And now, alone in a room at Morton Thiokol, he watched the launch on a television monitor. 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger broke apart.
Boisjoly later described that moment, in testimony,
and in personal accounts documented by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. He said he felt two things simultaneously: relief that it was finally over, and a grief so total he could not speak. He had written in his personal diary the night before, "I only hope this launch does not result in a catastrophe." He knew. He had always known. He had the data, the memo, the photographs. He had stood in that room and put the evidence on the table. And then he had watched 7 people die on a television screen, alone, because the institution he worked for had decided that a schedule mattered more than a seal. That is not an accident. That is a choice. Documented, signed, and witnessed by the man who tried to stop it. This isn't history. It's a warning. 17 years after Challenger, on February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated on re-entry over Texas and Louisiana. 7 astronauts. Again. The cause was a piece of foam insulation that had broken off during launch and damaged the thermal protection tiles on the left wing. During the 16 days Columbia was in orbit, engineers at NASA's debris assessment team identified the problem. They requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. The request was denied by managers who determined, without the imagery, that the damage was not a safety concern. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, in its final report of August 2003, explicitly cited the normalization of deviance as a contributing cause. They cited Diane Vaughan's work on Challenger by name. They documented the same pattern: engineers raising alarms, managers filtering the information upward, institutional pressure overriding technical judgment. NASA had read the Rogers Commission report. They had studied Challenger. They had programs and procedures designed to prevent exactly this.
And 17 years later, in a different shuttle, with a different crew, the same organizational failure killed 7 more people. This is what makes the Challenger disaster something other than history. Roger Boisjoly was not a whistleblower in the dramatic sense. He did not leak documents to journalists or go to Congress behind his employer's back. He worked inside the system. He used the system's own tools: memos, formal classifications, official teleconferences, signed documentation. He did everything the institution asked of him, and the institution absorbed all of it and launched anyway. After the accident, Boisjoly testified fully and honestly before the Rogers Commission. He did not protect Morton Thiokol. He did not protect NASA. He told the truth about what had happened in that room, and the professional consequences were immediate. He was isolated within the company. Colleagues stopped speaking to him. He was eventually placed on indefinite personal leave. He never returned to aerospace engineering. He spent the remainder of his career giving lectures on engineering ethics. He spoke at universities and professional conferences about what it means to hold a technical position in an institution that has decided it already knows the answer, about what it costs to be right. He died in 2012. The normalization of deviance he embodied, the pattern Vaughan named because of him, is not a relic of 1980s NASA. It has been documented in the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, where BP engineers raised concerns about well integrity that were overridden by schedule pressure. It appeared in the Boeing 737 MAX certification process, where safety engineers' objections were managed rather than resolved, and 346 people died in 2 crashes. It appears in hospitals, in financial institutions, in every large organization where the pressure to perform accumulates faster than the willingness to stop. The institutions change. The pattern does not. The next time you hear the official version of a story, ask yourself, who is holding the pen? We tell the Challenger story as a story about an O-ring. It's cleaner that way. A mechanical failure.
a rubber seal that couldn't handle the cold. A tragic, but ultimately technical event that produced reforms, investigations, better procedures. The kind of story that has an ending, a lesson learned, a system improved, a disaster that made the next mission safer. That story is easier to live with. Because the other story, the real one, doesn't have a clean ending. The real story is about what happens inside an institution when the pressure to perform becomes louder than the evidence in front of it. It's about the specific, documented moment when a group of managers told their engineers to stop thinking like engineers.
It's about a man who wrote the warning 6 months early, put the photographs on the table the night before, watched it happen anyway, told the truth about all of it, and was quietly removed from the industry he had spent his life in. Roger Boisjoly did everything right. He used the correct channels. He filed the correct documents. He used the correct classification. Criticality 1, loss of crew and vehicle. He made his case in the room where the decision was being made, with the people who had the authority to change it. And none of it was enough. Not because the evidence was weak, because the institution had already decided. This is the thing that should stay with you. Not the O-ring, not the temperature, not even the 7 people who died on that Tuesday morning while school children watched on classroom televisions across America. What should stay with you is the knowledge that right now, in some building, in some company, in some institution, there is someone sitting at a desk with data that says something is wrong. They have filed the memo. They have raised the flag. They have put the photographs on the table. And somewhere above them, someone is asking them to put on their management hat. If the Challenger disaster was documented, predicted, and preventable, and it was, what else are we still getting wrong? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the hidden financial system that was designed in secret by the wealthiest men in America and has been running the world ever since. The truth was written down. It always is. You can't unlearn the truth. Now the question is, what will you do with it?
They were told it was a fire. Just a fire. Roof of the turbine hall. Bring foam, bring water. Standard procedure. So they came without dosimeters, without respirators, without the lead-lined suits sitting in a storage room 2 buildings away that nobody thought to unlock because nobody said the word radiation. 28 firefighters walked toward reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the early hours of April 26, 1986, equipped for a building fire. They were walking into the most radioactive environment in human history. Within hours, some of them could taste metal on their tongues. Their skin began to tan, not from heat, but from gamma radiation passing through their bodies at a rate that exceeded any scale their instruments could measure. One firefighter later described the sensation as pleasant at first, like standing in warm sunlight. That is what 15,000 Röntgen per hour feels like from the outside. From the inside, it is your bone marrow stopping.